President, I rise today to speak about the unrest that we have seen, especially in Baltimore in the last week, and to a lesser extent in several other cities around the country, including in the city of Philadelphia and my state of Pennsylvania. There's been, of course, no shortage of discussions on this matter, going back to last year to the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, and those surrounding other flashpoints that have involved law enforcement officials. We have, in one way or another, landed on a bit of a national conversation about police practices. And that's a good conversation. I think we should have that. I, for instance, think we should seriously consider body cameras for use by police officers. I think this conversation is closely related to some other things that we need to be talking about as well. The problems of urban America that have a number of causes and that certainly deserve our attention and our action. For instance, I think we can and we should be talking about how we can create better jobs and better economic growth, a better economic climate in our cities, especially our big cities. We need to talk about how we can bring down a terribly high rate of poverty that has been persistent for decades in our cities. We need to talk about how we can improve our schools, which have been letting down too many, especially poor families in our big cities. And we ought to talk about family structure, because we know that a breakdown of families contributes enormously to all kinds of social pathologies, from involvement in gangs to drug use and drug dealing and criminality in general, and of course poverty itself. We can talk about guns too, and I remain proud of the work that I've done across the aisle to try to make it more difficult for guns to fall in the hands of people who have no right to be using them, criminals and those who are with mental illness. So these are all things that we ought to be talking about in this great debate, Mr. President, and we should be acting upon these things here in the Senate and in state and local legislative bodies across the country. But, Mr. President, I think there's something in this discussion that we should also be willing to talk about. It's something that hasn't gotten as much attention during this national conversation about police practices, and it's something that's been bothering me for some time. I think it came to a head this past week in Baltimore. And so I'm going to talk about this now, and I'm going to continue to talk about this in the coming weeks and months, because I think it's an important part of this national discussion. My concern specifically is over the growing scapegoating of police officers in America today. Now, before I go any further, let me be perfectly clear about one central point. If a police officer acts unprofessionally, acts outside the bounds of ethical standards, or breaks the law, then by all means that police officer has to be held accountable and punished for his or her transgression. There's no excuse whatsoever for unlawful police conduct. That absolutely cannot be tolerated, not even one little bit. And I'll be clear about another point. It's true that there are real and horrible cases of police misconduct. No one's that I know is trying to deny that or sweep it under the rug or pretend that it doesn't happen. It does happen, and it should never be tolerated. But let's also keep this in perspective. There are doctors who break the law. There are accountants who break the law. There are lawyers who break the law. There are elected public officials who break the law. The fact is, there are bad actors in every profession, in every line of work, in every walk of life, and that's true of police as well. But if you listen to many of the police critics that we hear from today, you'd think that there's some sort of epidemic of crimes perpetrated by the police. And that, Mr. President, I assure you is not true. So in my years in public life, I've spent a lot of time with police officers. I've gotten to know many of them. I've gone on rides with them. I've listened to their concerns. I've met with them. I've supported their community organizations. I've attended the charitable fundraisers that they've held. And by and large, I can tell you, I don't know of any group of people anywhere in our society who are more dedicated professionals than the policemen and the policewomen across our country. Far from the epidemic of police misdeeds that some claim to be happening out there, I think just the opposite is true. The overwhelming majority of police are honest men and women. They have very high ethical standards. They don't have a racist bone in their body. Our police have an incredibly difficult and often dangerous job to do, and it's an incredibly important one as well. Our communities, let's face it, we all depend upon the police. And that's probably more true in urban areas than anywhere else in the country. So we need to have a conversation about bad police practices, but we also need to have a conversation about what a great job the vast majority of police are doing across our country and how much they deserve our thanks and our support. Now, unfortunately, the scenes we witnessed in Baltimore last week really certainly work against the kind of gratitude that we ought to show our law enforcement community. I'm not talking about what happened to Freddie Gray. Mr. Gray absolutely deserves justice. If the police in the Gray case committed crimes, then they must be punished. I don't question that in the least. But what happened last week in Baltimore was not only about Freddie Gray. In scenes reminiscent of last year in Ferguson, last week in Baltimore, we saw a great American city dissolve into utter lawlessness. We saw riots that destroyed a senior citizen center, a CVS drugstore, numerous cars, all kinds of property. We saw dozens of injuries, including injuries to over 90 police officers. We had a curfew imposed and the National Guard called in to restore order as though this were some kind of war zone. We even had Major League Baseball cancel 2 games and conduct 1 game where no fans were permitted to attend. They played before an empty stadium. How is that allowed to happen in a great American city? Well, some people excuse this lawlessness and point to the difficult underlying conditions in the local community. But let's ask ourselves, who gets hurt the most by these riots? Well, we know. It's the very poor people from these communities who now have no senior center to go to. They can't go to CVS to get their prescription filled or to pick up necessities for their kids. And of course, there's this big red flashing neon sign telling businesses large and small that could provide jobs and economic activity there to stay away. So where did the police come in on this? Well, President Obama called the looters and rioters in Baltimore thugs. And President Obama's gotten some criticism for that. Well, I just would use an objective, indisputable term. These people are criminals. It's a serious crime to set a fire to a car or a building. It's a serious crime to throw a rock or a bottle at a police officer. Assault and battery is a serious crime. It's a serious crime to engage in looting. And people who commit those acts are criminals. And they should be arrested, and they should be charged, and they should be prosecuted and punished to the full extent of the law. But in order for that to happen, we need the police. We need them to be actively engaged. The Baltimore police officers have reported that they were ordered to stand down last week as the city was being destroyed. Now that's pretty tough to take, especially, I assume, for the law-abiding Baltimore citizens who need that police protection. Instead of standing down in the face of wanton criminal acts, the police need to be allowed to do their job. They should make arrests. They should restore order. There should never be another American city that looks the way Baltimore did last week. Now, when 6 police officers were charged on Friday in the death of Freddie Gray, there were celebrations on the streets in Baltimore. And Madam President, I'll say, at a certain level, that's completely understandable. Whatever Mr. Gray did on that day, the day that he was arrested, he certainly didn't deserve to die. And his death cries out for answers. We need to have answers to these questions. And in the passions of last week's, I understand why people cheered the appearance that the criminal justice system was standing up for Mr. Gray. I totally understand that. But let me ask a question. What happens if these accused police officers are found not to have broken the law? What if one of them, or several of, or even if all of them, are found not to have violated the law? What happens then? Will we see Baltimore and maybe other cities erupt in flames once more? That's already what appears to be forecast in some quarters. And what about those 6 individual police officers? Well, we know what happens if they're found guilty. If they're found guilty, they're going to go to jail for a long time, and that'll be appropriate. But what happens if they're found innocent? In the Ferguson, Missouri case, a grand jury found that there was no reason to believe a crime had been committed by the accused officer, Darren Wilson. And the U.S. Justice Department did an investigation, and they decided not to bring civil rights charges against Officer Wilson. So Officer Wilson was found to have committed no wrongdoing, neither by the local grand jury nor by the Civil Rights Division of the United States Justice Department. But what happened to Officer Wilson? Has anybody asked that question? What happened to Officer Wilson? Well, he faced multiple death threats. He ended up having to leave his job on the police force, the one job he'd always wanted and he'd loved to do. He ended up having to move out of his home and go somewhere else. And he's only 28 years old. Now, the accused police officers in Baltimore have life stories too. One of them is Police Sergeant Alicia White. She's a 30-year-old African-American woman who joined the Baltimore police force 5 years ago. She's engaged to be married. A local Baltimore minister who knows Officer White described her this way, quote, "She wanted to be a police officer because she is a Christian and wants to be a good role model for young black women. And she wanted to be that good cop in the community and bridge the gap between the police and the neighborhoods." Of the 6 arrested officers, 3 are African Americans, 3 are white. And none of this means that any of these officers necessarily acted appropriately or right in this case. It's quite possible that they didn't, and if so, the court system, our legal judicial system, will determine that. What I'm simply trying to point out is that these police officers have human faces. They're human beings. And these officers are going to go through hell whether they deserve to or not. Their lives will never be the same whether they are guilty or innocent. There will be many people in the community who shun them, even if they're found to have done nothing wrong. And what message does that send to all the tens of thousands of police officers all across America who risk their lives every day to protect their communities from criminals? Unfortunately, it says there are a lot of people out there who are looking to misplace a lot of social problems we face in our country on the backs of the police. It says they might not be allowed to do their jobs when their communities most need them to do their jobs. It says that one day, should they find themselves accused of wrongdoing, there might be a public mob that clamors for their conviction and threatens to burn down the city if the legal system finds them innocent. Madam President, that is a sad state of affairs. Now, I'm not defending the officers in the Gray case. I don't know whether they are guilty or innocent. I expect the legal system to determine that, but that's not really my point. My point is that while there are some police officers who act terribly, and that must be stopped, there's no epidemic of police criminality in this country. We should absolutely discuss and act upon the issues that surround police and community relations, by all means. And we also need to acknowledge the critical role the police play in keeping our communities safe, and the overwhelming majority of police who conduct themselves honorably day in and day out. Madam President, the next time there's a demonstration about police conduct, I hope it's a demonstration to thank the police for their dedication, their hard work, and their courage. That's a demonstration I'll be honored to join. And I yield the floor.